Hello, welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Marisa Klein. I'm the museum's creative content manager. Today I'm joined by my colleague, historian Dr. Elizabeth White. We'll hear more about you in just a moment, but first I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that today there's a film called Operation Finale that is opening in theaters nationwide. It's about the capture of the notorious Nazi criminal Adolf Eichmann. So we had the pleasure of screening that movie here at our museum, but today we wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the Nazi hunters that work here at our own museum. So before I turn it over to you, I just want to acknowledge that we are taking questions throughout this program. So if you have anything that you would like to ask us, please submit it to Facebook and we'll try to take as many of those questions throughout the time as we can. So again, you are Dr. White and we call you Barry. So if that's all right, I'll call you Barry throughout the interview. So you worked for 29 years at the United States Department of Justice in the office that investigated Nazi criminals who were living in the United States.
Yes.
So I want to hear all about that career, but first I think it's important that we acknowledge something, and that is that we, in the title of this talk, we use the term Nazi hunters. Now, you take a little issue with that term, and I'd like to hear why.
Well, it makes it sound like we were vigilantes who were going after people because of their political beliefs. And of course, the Justice Department doesn't do that. We were law enforcement officials, and our job was to find people residing in the United States who had persecuted Nazi victims and then take legal action against them. And the office won 108 cases. Of those, I think only maybe 6 subjects had even been German citizens before the war. And I'm not sure any of those had belonged to the Nazi Party.
And why were there so few Germans?
Well, the vast majority of the actual murders of the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust occurred in Eastern Europe.
Okay.
And in order to carry them out, the Nazis recruited tens of thousands of non-German locals. And then at the end of the war, the documentation about a lot of these murders was captured by the Soviet Union's Red Army. It wound up in communist archives that Westerners couldn't access during the Cold War. And so for those Eastern European perpetrators who managed to flee to the West, some of them were able to lie about their pasts and get visas to come to the United States, claiming that they were legitimate refugees, even Nazi victims.
Okay, well, thank you for that background, and we'll try to avoid the term Nazi hunters, but no promises.
Well, I know it's concise. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And so when we were talking about your background, I did want to touch on something that I found interesting, and that was you talked about how growing up in the segregated South influenced your career trajectory. Could you tell me a little more about that, please?
Well, thanks to my parents, I realized at a pretty young age that racism and segregation were wrong, and I really struggled with the question of why so many people I knew who seemed like kind, church-going, patriotic Americans supported a system that was clearly cruel and contrary to their supposed values. So then when I started studying European history, I was really drawn to the history of modern Germany, in part because it provides the prime example of how highly educated, supposedly civilized people can be manipulated to support and even commit genocide.
Right, and it was that history and interest in Germany that led you eventually to your work at the Department of Justice.
Yeah, I mean, when I got the opportunity to actually play a role in helping to achieve some measure of justice for victims of racism, I was really honored and excited to take it.
And now the part of the Department of Justice that you worked in that looked into Nazi perpetrators in the United States, I heard it was kind of born out of a scandal. Could you tell me about that history?
Well, in 1971, West Germany asked to extradite Mrs. Russell Ryan, who was a housewife in Queens, New York.
And I have her photo here for us.
Yes. So the Germans accused her of being Hermine Braunsteiner, who'd been a very sadistic SS woman guard at Majdanek concentration camp. Prisoners at Majdanek called her the stomping mare because of her brutality, and they accused her of seizing children out of the arms of their mothers and taking them to the gas chambers there. So this story really electrified the press, public opinion, and pretty soon other stories came out about scores of so-called Nazi criminals, Nazi war criminals, who were living freely in the United States. And then there was actually an official investigation which found that the U.S. government had failed in its duty to prevent the United States from becoming a haven for Nazi criminals. So in 1979, the Justice Department created the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, and gave it responsibility for detecting, investigating, and removing from the United States persons who had participated in Nazi persecution, and also with responsibility for preventing any further persecutors from coming here.
Well, we'll hear more about the OSI's work, but I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge our audience. So thank you for joining us today on Facebook Live. I'm here with historian Dr. Elizabeth White. If you have any questions throughout this time as we're talking about the investigation of Nazi perpetrators in the United States, please submit them and we'll take questions throughout. So I see that we already have a question from a Matthew Meehan on Twitter. So he wants to know, is there an estimate of how many are still hiding in this country? So I'm assuming he's meaning Nazi perpetrators.
Well, there's no way to know. We don't know who we don't know. But I can say that at this point, any Nazi perpetrators who are still alive are in their 90s. So I think we can assume that there are very few.
Okay. So thank you for that question. And as I said at the beginning, that today a movie called Operation Finale is coming out. And in this film and other ones, we often see brave agents in the field tracking down Nazis. But we see these more, I guess, these action-filled scenes. But what we don't see is the behind-the-scenes work of a historian. So can you tell us about your work in these cases as a historian?
Sure. Actually, when OSI started, it hired a number of criminal investigators in addition to attorneys and a couple of historians. But pretty soon, the historians replaced the investigators, and that's because it was the historians who were able to find the documents that became the principal evidence in OSI's cases. So many decades after the war, it was almost impossible to find eyewitnesses who could say, that's him in court, especially since most of the victims who survived didn't know their persecutors. So OSI sent its historians out to archives in Europe, here. We collected records about the units that committed Nazi crimes. Example would be a mobile SS unit that carried out mass executions. And then we would go through those records to identify the people who served in those units and try to determine whether any of them had come to the United States. And for much of my time at OSI, that was my responsibility to find perpetrators who had come to the U.S. and to build sufficient evidence to open an official investigation. And then it was usually assigned to another historian who worked under the direction of OSI attorneys to develop the case and take it to court.
And can you tell us more about some of those cases?
Well, I opened dozens of investigations that turned into successful OSI cases. One example of a group of cases that were related comes from a roster that I and another OSI historian found in an archive in Prague in 1990. And this roster was of hundreds of men who had guarded the killing centers and the Jewish forced labor camps in Nazi-occupied southern Poland, where over 1.5 million Jews were killed. From this roster, we were able to go out and find documents in many other archives about the workings, the duties of these men, and I used these documents to identify a dozen who had come to the United States and who were then successfully pursued by OSI. So then I worked on other kinds of cases, some involving concentration camp guards, including guards from Auschwitz whose duties involved guarding as Jews were being unloaded from the trains and sorted and marched off to the gas chambers. Also members of different kinds of police units that carried out deportations and roundups and mass shootings.
And so since you were part of the Office of Special Investigations, and so part of this work was trying to not only find people in the United States, but keep people from entering the United States as well.
Yeah.
That sounds like a 24/7 type of job. What was that like to be part of that?
Yeah, that was another one of my principal duties for much of my time at OSI. So when we identified a Nazi perpetrator who had not come to the United States, then we would put the name on the watch list of people who are barred from entering the U.S. Europeans, we actually put over 70,000 names of suspected Nazi persecutors on the watch list. So it really wasn't uncommon for me to get a call at home, since the flights usually arrived in the evenings or on the weekends, and I'd get a call from an immigration inspector at, say, Miami International Airport about someone who just arrived who was on the watch list and was planning to take his grandkids to Disney World. And so I kept a copy of the watch list at home so I could access the information about that person and advise the immigration inspector of how to question him and what to do with him. It was usually a man.
And what was that like for your family to have your life interrupted by these kind of calls?
Well, my children, they just sort of groan and say, oh, another Nazi call, when dinner's going to be late, One of the things, most SS men during the war had to get tattoos under their arms of their blood type. And so sometimes the immigration inspectors would have a person take off his shirt so he could check to see if there was either a tattoo or a scar where it had been removed.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And can you tell us, since we're of course at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, how our museum can play a role in some of these cases or investigations?
Well, actually, after the museum opened in the 1990s, it was a really important resource for us in two ways, basically. One was it has collected copies of records and scores of archives in Eastern Europe that became evidence in our cases. It was so much easier and more productive for OSI historians to just travel across town and do research here instead of going to Ukraine, where they have maybe 2 weeks to try to go through hundreds of boxes of records. And then the other thing that the museum did for us was allow its senior historian, Dr. Peter Black, to testify as an expert in some of OSI's cases. The historical expert played a crucial role in OSI trials by authenticating and explaining the documentary evidence. Peter had, before he was wooed away by the museum, he had been the chief historian before me at the Office of Special Investigations, and he was one of the world's leading experts on certain aspects of how the Holocaust was perpetrated. So his testimony was really key, and in fact, every case that he testified in, OSI won.
Every single one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So it looks like we have a question from Tracy from Ontario. And hold on just one moment. We want to know first, speaking of projects Dr. Black testified on, there's been a recent case that's been getting publicity about the recent case that was resolved.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about what's been in the news lately about Nazi perpetrators?
Yeah, that was the case of Jakub Pali, and his name was actually on those rosters that I mentioned finding in Prague. We developed evidence showing that he had served at a Nazi camp in Travniki in Nazi-occupied southern Poland. And at the trial, Peter Black testified that the men who served at Travniki served as guards at a Jewish forced labor camp there. And on one day in November 1943, these 6,000 Jewish prisoners at this camp, men, women, and children, were all shot to death. So the judge ruled that by carrying out his duties, Pali had persecuted the prisoners at Travniki and prevented them from escaping their murder. then that case happened 14 years ago. He was ordered removed from the United States, but we couldn't find a country to take him. This was a common problem. A number of OSI subjects who were ordered removed managed to live out their lives peacefully in their homes here. But last week, Germany finally agreed to take him, and he was removed there.
So we have a question from our audience member about this specific case. So a Facebook user named Harry Cyrus, he said, I agree that what Pally did was criminal, but 70 years later? How do you respond to the time element question?
Well, I agree. It would have been much better if he had been held to account 70 years ago, and especially if he had not, by lying, been able to obtain a visa that might have been given to a legitimate refugee or victim. Right? At what point do we say to a perpetrator, oh, congratulations, you've managed to escape justice for so long, you can just live out your life in peace now? We certainly wouldn't say that about someone who had helped plan the 9/11 attacks if we were to find him 50 years from now here in the United States. Yeah. People see the photos of Polly, being carried out on a stretcher, and they can't see him as his victims saw him. People say, well, he was just a small fry, but he was not unimportant to his victims. And his removal confirms the principle that we were all working for, which is that the United States, which has been a refuge for centuries for the persecuted, should not provide a safe haven for the persecutors.
Great. Well, thank you for that question. And it looks like we have another from Grace on Facebook. She wanted to know, is Mrs. Ryan still alive? So that was a woman we spoke about early on in the program.
Right. No, she was convicted in Germany in the 1970s and sentenced to life in prison. And she might have been released a couple of weeks before she died, but she basically served out her sentence. I forget exactly when she died.
Okay. So, thank you for that question, Grace, and thank you all for joining us on Facebook Live today. If you have more questions about this topic, please post them to our Facebook page, and we will try to answer them and share some more museum resources. So we encourage you to follow the museum on all of our social channels so that you can hear about our very next Facebook Live as well. So thank you again for joining us, Barry, today, and thank you for tuning in.